Welcome everyone for today's final session of SuPWR's dissemination. Really glad you all could join us. We've had a really interesting morning and a very rich discussion in the morning, and we'll continue some of that, but move this a little bit towards sort of like thinking about what are the pathways towards solidarity, which is also like a question at the end. So what in SuPWR we also have are some international advisory board members, and as Anu said, she was one of them. And then there are other people throughout the world and South Asia that are part of our international advisory board. But then we have also had some country level advisory board members who are one of who's present in the room, and there's several online. So what we're doing in this session is really summarizing a little bit for those of you who haven't joined in the morning, it's a very big project. So it falls to Sohela and I to first sum up the project and then the country level findings a little bit, and then we will move to again a moderate discussion, but this time hearing some of the reflections from our international advisory board members and other prominent feminists who have like really been instrumental in shaping this field. So I'll introduce them later, and then we'll have this. But we're hoping that we should have still enough time, about half an hour at the end, for real discussion and questions, and I think and comments, because this is a project that's coming to an end, but the conversations we want to really keep going. So just to start then with some introductions to the project, and I'm just going to share my screen. Is that? I'll share it. Okay, sorry. 1 second. Great, thank you. Okay, so again, starting off again with a note of gratitude to all the activists who have shared the space and shared and trusted us with the stories, but also just thinking about the key findings, because that's what we're really interested in. So as my colleagues Samreen and Priya and I summarized in the beginning, we've had findings across 3 levels. One is about theorizing and new theorizations of backlash. And how do we best conceptually and empirically capture this phenomena in contemporary for women's movements? How does this affect feminist collectives, and how do they retain that voice, and how do they still shape that agenda, despite and perhaps because of backlash? And then what works to sustain and advance gender equality? And as I said, each of these centers activist accounts of what backlash is, what it does to them, what it does to their movements, and how these gains are sustained. So very quickly then, in terms of theorizing backlash, we found backlash as not just a repressive or regressive force, but also sort of like a regenerative force, not in a positive way, not valorizing backlash, but attending to the very intimate lives and experiences, and attending to backlash from the ways in which this is experienced. So we've theorized backlash as both structure and event, and following Meena Das's conceptualization of saying that backlash has a very long tail that extends both back into the past, but also in the future, and these tentacles attach itself to everyday life. And this has implications for how we understand backlash, whether it's just one contemporary thing, an event, or also like, a larger structure. We have backlash as, taking various forms, and literature has talked about ranging from overt attacks to different subtler forms like gender washing. But the main thing that it does is that it has differential effects for differentially placed subjects. So that means that, not everybody experiences backlash in the same way. And while there are larger regressive forces, we still have backlash specifically as distinct from retrogressive projects, other retrogressive projects, especially when it comes to anti-gender backlash. And this is sustained by these intersectional hierarchies and processes of making the subjects as others, like, we are, central and you're the marginalized kind of thing. In terms of women's movements, we found that the effects of backlash vary with how the woman question has been framed within the post-colonial nation building. And Sohela, I'm sure, will tell us a little bit more about that. And the fact that the composition and the way in which these collectives are formed and who are in these collectives is crucial in determining what kind of backlash is faced by them, but it's also crucial then to the possibilities of action. And this is how, like the movements who are centrally comprised of the members that are affected by a particular issue are sort of like dealing with backlash in very different ways. They face more intense backlash, but it's also more sort of like a glue, to come together. In terms of alliance and coalition building, it involves trade-offs with marginalized groups, and unfortunately, the onus of solidarity building often falls on the marginalized groups, and that's what really inverts the logic of how solidarity really should ideally be built. We also said that home is not a refuge for these activists. Home is a site of contestation. It's a site of backlash, and the historic encounters with how backlash has been experienced, as well as the anticipated backlash that happens, actually shapes these activists' choices, their imaginations, and they're not just the material, not just the non-material and affective consequences, but also the material consequences of how backlash is experienced. And the backlash, and all of our activists and movements told us that it really hurts when backlash comes from the intimate register, where you don't expect the backlash to happen. So, for example, within a particular movement, or within feminist movements, or within families, and that really hurts. So in terms of strategies, we found that movements are continuously adaptive and flexible, and they determine these risks of and gains of their strategies, and they are continuously adapting. But that just doesn't, and that includes strategic invisibility sometimes selective collaborations, and pragmatic choices. But they also shape the terms of the debate. Like Shana said, it's not just that they're reacting to the backlash, but they're actually actively shaping this through identifying and mobilizing affective opportunity structures, using art, using different ways to secure broader support and expand their membership base. But they're also continuously seeking allies, even with compromised institutions, and the state then becomes both an aggressor but also a supporter, and they interact differently with these different institutions. We found that intersectional alliances are key. They're complex. They have to be built across issues, across generations. We found that that activists really need space for reflection, for rest, and for building enduring solidarities, and that these practices and processes are really crucial for repairing and healing from the effects of backlash, and where here we termed care as sort of like both political and collective in terms of rejuvenating movements, and the idea that the recognition of these differences, but also the recognition of togetherness acts as a magnet, but also as a glue for movements under backlash. So care becomes then both a necessary and a sufficient condition of solidarity. So those are the very high level findings. And as I said, we've got lots of different things, and we will, at the end of Sohela's remarks, after Sohela's remarks, we will actually present you the animation that we've made in this project, and then we'll move on to the IAB session. So over to you, Sahil.
Thanks, Deepta. Oh, better not forget my notes. Hello to everyone online. Thank you for joining us. So since the start of this project, what we have been grappling with and what we started with is there a South Asia story? You ask Latin American scholars, they will be able to give you a narrative of how transition happened in Latin American countries, and also, in a sense, what role austerity policies played, and then also looking at how women's movement figure in terms of contestations with the state. Of course, it varies across Latin American countries, but there is a story. And for Eastern Europe, we can look at it in a particular way in terms of state post-transition from Soviet Union state rolling back certain rights and capacities, but then also expansion of certain things. And then what happens there now as you have the rise of oppositional forces? So what about South Asia? And we are still grappling with the answer, but I'm going to talk a little bit from the country context and then also try to weave in a South Asia story. Oh, that's very dramatic. Definitely. Those of you online, our skylights are opening. I don't know why, but very dramatic, definitely, as we talk about South Asia. So, as you heard from Deepta, our struggles there are 16 of them, and they're based at their configuration is different, composition is different, how they interact with the state is different, and then where they're based. Are they at the subnational level? Do they operate at the national level? All of that varies. So stitching a story from the bottom up is a challenge. But let me just say some of the things that we are seeing emerging from the morning's discussion. One is, of course, what we grappled with is what kind of space exists in Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and India for women's movement. And that depends on basically configuration of power at the moment in terms of the regime type that you have, and also who is in power, right? Who's the oppositional actor that has formalized power. But it's also the kind of social power that certain forces held. You heard from Deepta that it is about also what happens in the intimate space, the backlash that you face at the community level, who may not necessarily hold formal power. So depending on the struggle you're looking at, Pakistan, my colleague Chandana talked about, is quite a hostile territory in the sense that a regime type moves between military and civilian rule, but then in the way religion has played a role in that nation's making, but also the contestations around that and what that means in terms of the space that exists for certain agendas that will touch on the body or the religion becomes quite difficult, right? For India, before BJP came into power, we started this project when we looked at BJP coming into power. The contestations were slightly different because you had a democratic opening. So it allowed you to then hit your agenda to different either party agendas or to different spaces that may exist at the local government level, let's say, or at the community level in a particular way. But of course, you had caste, class, and other forms of intersectional challenges. So that creates the space you have for your agenda is shaped by that. For Nepal, which is our exciting country, partly because it managed to stay democratic for a long time and transition through a post-conflict negotiation process where actually women played quite a critical role in that negotiation. The opening for agendas, at least for adoption of certain issues, was quite different than what existed in other spaces. For Bangladesh, we went through a 15-year autocratic rule. Before that, our rights and agendas were connected to development, right? Including during the autocratic period, it was connected to development. So it gave you certain openings, and then it didn't for certain things. So for example, I mean, all across South Asia, if we looked at it, and it's not surprising what you see in the literature, that issues that touch on the body is always contested quite a lot if it is about sexuality, sexual rights, around violence against women. But at the same time, what was surprising for us to see is, if we look at it, that issues around livelihoods were quite contested. That is where you'd think that it wouldn't be. But in Bangladesh, for example, if you look at garment workers' solidarity and how the struggle was going on, it's partly because business elites are part of who form policies and what goes on in terms of what kind of rights you're granted or not. So you couldn't necessarily say partly because of one particular agenda that how space would vary. You had to go into a finer granular analysis in terms of, well, what is the configuration around that particular policy agenda, and then how would negotiation take place? So that was important for us to think through. What was very important for us is to connect moments of transition. When did contestation happen around who holds power? And then whether you were present in that moment, in that sense that whether the movement itself had representation in when those negotiations were happening, and then what can you claim from that? And for very marginalized groups, having a presence in those high-level spaces is very, very difficult. So it is about who is representing your voice and what do you push through. What is also important in terms of the current literature as we see and what we see happening in South Asia, except for Nepal, is the story of de-democratization. What you see in India, what you see, Pakistan has always struggled with it, what you saw in Bangladesh, and we are struggling to come out, is partly that gender plays a critical role in the way gender is co-opted, used for legitimizing the regime's rule, or in the way it is sort of eroded certain things. And the kind of erosion that you see is partly you may be granted certain rights, but then those rights are not implemented. It's that, of course, when we talk about backlash, we focus on the excesses, right? Spectacular kind of violence. But what is quite insidious is that silent erosion, or things not being granted, your agenda not even coming into discussion at all. Think about, if you think about domestic workers' rights and what is granted and what is not, for example, in India, it will highlight what's going on. Why isn't that agenda even for discussion? So in a sense, the erosion that you see of rights and protection and what states can do or will do or not do, that is a key part of the story in terms of what is the quality of your democracy and how that is co-opted for particular ways, or how then the quality weakens, because it is about who gets to deliberate and who gets to present, who gets represented, right? Having said that, obviously, Deepta touched on the issue about the women's movement that we worked with continuously strategizing, right? You re-strategize, you adapt. The choices that you make have costs and trade-offs. But given that the strategies that we are seeing, and we are seeing quite a bit of innovative strategies, the question is about sustainability of these movements. This is a live research project, and the situation is quite dynamic because it changes quite fast. And from all of the country presentations, we saw that it shifts quite fast. But at the same time, the key lesson for us is, how do you sustain solidarity? Solidarity along intersectional line, solidarity along cross-sectional with other movements, solidarity with transnational alliances. These are not new strategies. We all know about that. We have used that in feminist movements quite a lot. But the question is, given the current geopolitical shifts and what is going on in South Asia, is it fragile? It's a very fragile kind of solidarity. Are we going to hold on to it? Can we hold on to it? And for how long, right? Collaboration and cooperation happens. But at the same time, I feel like we are on a balance. And we don't know where we are going to tilt. Now, I'm not supposed to give you doom and gloom, and I should end with how Deepta talked about like care-based work and how important it is. But it is also important to recognize that the juncture we are at, we can go either way. It's not just one step forward, two steps back. We can be pushed very, very further back in this region and lose all our gains. And it is that moment where we actually need to reflect and perhaps think through the strategies that we have always used. If institutional space is open, you engage, you keep a seat at the table, you use your personal networks, you build larger coalitions to show you have numbers. All of those are important strategies. You create alternative narratives. You try to create a different kind of world vision, right? Very marginalized groups use different kind of innovative strategies that we haven't seen before from all the country cases that we heard. Very important. But as a former economist, my question would be effectiveness, because I don't want to wait 100 years. I need to sustain now. And the question is, how will we sustain and hold? And it's important there to then think about, are our strategies still effective? Do we engage still in the same way? If we change tack, what do we change tack with? And this is where the value of this project is. What have we learned from each other? And we have learned quite a bit. And we can talk about that in Q&A. Thank you.
Great. So now we're just going to play the super animation. As I've said to you, there are 9 other short films. There's a whole visual exhibition. So this is part of a repertoire of arts-based methods that the movements themselves have wanted to display. But this is coming out of, like, what we thought is a call to action for all of us, and so we just want to play that. So over to you, Leah.
Women's movements across South Asia face unprecedented challenges, and our hard-won gains are under attack from actors across all aspects of our lives, including the state, employers, conservative religious groups, print and social media, and even our families and communities. Over generations, we have experienced violence and threats, stigmatization, regressive laws, shrinking civic spaces, and reduced funding for sustaining our movements. We battle fatigue and burnout as we face this well-resourced backlash. But in the face of these challenges, we survive, deriving strength from the past to resist violence in the present and to fight for a better future. And in this fight, we are not alone. Across identities and causes, we organize, we resist, we build spaces of collective care and healing. We grow intergenerational movements. In solidarity, we rise, stronger, louder together. As activists, we learn and sometimes fail to work through our differences. Knowing that we must stand together, diverse but not divided, defiant and determined, enduring in spite of the backlash. Together, we can overcome challenges by building alliances and standing in solidarity. There is power, joy, and hope in the collective. Join us in the fight against these regressive forces. Build and support spaces of collective care and repair. Now is the time to envision and fund bold feminist futures.
Great, thank you. Just to say that this animation was produced by a Nepali filmmaker or animation maker company based in Nepal. So that's one good thing. And the other thing is this has been translated into all 4 major languages, because I know there are lots of dialects, etc., and languages in each of these countries that we're speaking about. But this animation is available for you all to like disseminate and like send out to your networks in Nepali, in Hindi, in Urdu, and in Bangla. So there are 4 versions apart from this English version, and really a big round of applause goes also to Leah, our colleague who's like led this arts-based method. So okay, so over to then the next part of the session, which is really about looking at these findings from the outside. So like we've been involved in this project, but we really wanted to draw on the expertise of some of our colleagues and friends and allies in the larger feminist space who've been so supportive of us. So could I first call to the table Naila? Professor Naila Kabir is a professor of gender and development. Yes, you're supposed to sit there. Naila is a professor of gender and development in the Department of International Development. She's also a faculty associate at LSE's International Inequalities Institute and on the governing board of the Atlantic Fellowship for Social and Economic Equity. She's done extensive advisory work with a ton of international agencies, but really the important bit is that she is a member of the Inequalities Advisory Group Bosch Foundation and a member of the advisory group the United Nations University Institute for Global Health, and her work has really been pivoting much more towards well-being, and she can tell you a bit more about that when I give her the floor. So thank you, Naila, for being here. Next, I'm going to move on to Maitrayee. Maitrayee Mukhopadhyay is actually under the name of Neeraja, but that's not Neeraja. I know she's a social anthropologist who specializes in social development with a focus on gender and development. Maitrayee works in the Department of Development, Policy and Practice at the Royal Tropical Institute, Amsterdam, and has 30 years of experience, over 30 years of experience, I would say, in gender and development research, advisory work, teaching, and training. I'm going to then move on to Professor Georgina Waylen, who we also have on screen. And Georgina was supposed to be here, but because of an NHS appointment, which are like gold dust, she was not able to come. But Georgina is the WJM Mackenzie Chair in Government at the University of Manchester. She has researched and published widely on aspects of gender and politics, and her publications include Engendering Transitions, Women's Mobilization Institutions and Gender Outcomes in 2007. And more recently, the Oxford, the Gender and Informal Institutions book in 2017. More recently, she has been researching on how democratic erosion is gendered. So thank you, Georgina, for being here. And then we finally move on to Professor Naomi Hossain. Naomi has been associated with the project since it was not a project. It was a proposal idea. And we still remember we had ideas have like this feedback group, and Naomi was part of that PRG with the proposal review group, and she basically said to us, rewrite the proposal, like this is all rubbish, and we did. We're like, it was like, and it was really thanks to Naomi, who really saw that what we were trying to do was not being reflected in what we were writing. And so a huge thanks to you, Naomi, for always being the guiding star for this project. You are a global research professor at the Department of Development Studies, SOAS. As a political sociologist interested in how people living with poverty and precarity get the public services they need, Naomi's work centers on 2 distinct areas. One is the politics of Bangladesh's development, and the contentious politics of public services and disasters beyond Bangladesh. And she brings frameworks of social history, particularly the moral economy, and has worked with researchers from around the world, as well as with social movements, civic actors, artists, governments, and aid agencies around the world. So I'm very, very honored to chair this session and work with and like get the views of everybody here. I'm going to open the floor first with two main questions. And I'll ask everybody to speak in whichever order really that you all want to. So in terms of like saying, what are your reflections or responses to these super findings? And you could take up either work on backlash or on strategies. So like, what is it that you feel, but also perhaps roll out the second question as well, which is, I mean, just looking at time and kind of thinking that maybe you could like combine your responses or not, depending on, is that in our work as academics, practitioners, or to influence policy, how do we build solidarities across regions? How do we really sustain those solidarities beyond that fragility, especially considering fractions, divisions, and challenges of context? So over to anyone who wants to speak, and Nyla's got a mic there, and if you all can just like unmute. Yeah, so let's start with you, Maitrayee.
Just a minute. Oh, hi. Hello. Okay, sorry that my name is actually, I think it's Nirja on the thing, but this is Maitrayee here. It's wonderful to be with you all, and it's really, really nice what I've read and what I heard now. I'll just raise one point that I resonated with me from the research, and that is to do with backlash, and which was that backlash is potentially generative. It engenders political subjectivities, it builds cohesive collectives, and resistant possibilities. And it resonated with me because I've been part of the other research that was going on. We were South India based, and it was on backlash. And it's we found something very, very similar. So that's why it resonated with me. I'm glad that you all have really brought this up, that backlash is not just kind of, that it's actually has potential, and it has, the resistance that it generates, the subjectivities, that the political subjectivities it espouses. And our study, for example, was really in the homeland of Hindutva, the ethno-nationalist politics that is prevalent in India now, especially in the north. It was in the heartland, actually. And here, a group of social activists, for example, who had been working on gender equality, men, because this is who had been working on gender equality, found themselves completely daunted and afraid of what the divisive politics going on, and had stopped being active. But it was through through a process of coming together, learning how to deal with this, forming collectives, that they rediscovered and reinvented the activism to build social solidarity between communities, which is Hindu and Muslim, actually, in that context. The social solidarity and cohesion is resistive. It resists the overarching story that the agents of ethno-nationalism are trying to tell you. And it actually fractures the homogenized story. And why I'm saying that these were very highly localized uh, endeavors and by people living in those places and spaces. But it had, as we saw in the 2024 elections, actually a macro level um, fallout and impact. So I think, and even if it didn't, the fact that it brought so many people together and was resistive is what I would say backlash as potentially generative really means. So I'll stop there because I think I've taken more than my 1 minute. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Maitrayee. Did you hear me through this? Yeah, okay, great. Let's go on to Georgina. If you'd like to share your thoughts about this.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm very sorry not to be with you in person, but it's been really fantastic to be involved in this project. You've produced some really important work, both methodologically and empirically. I mean, it's so rich and informative. And as you've already heard, I'm talking today very much from the perspective of someone who's worked in gender and politics scholarship for a long time, coming out of analysing women's movements and democratization, particularly in Latin America, but more recently on anti-gender movements and democratic erosion in the UK. But I'm also currently writing a book with a colleague on gender and comparative politics. And I'd in fact love to cite some of the papers that you've got coming out, if you could give me the citations and you're happy with that. And that's been kind of interesting in lots of ways, but also because in the process of writing it, we've kind of seen very clearly exactly how far the gender and politics scholarship is dominated by work done sort of in and on the global north and by scholars from the global north. And it's also reinforced for me how, as well as part of that, I think scholarship on women's movements and discussion of women's movement has faded a bit from some of the politics scholarship. And I think in part because a lot of people in gender and politics in the global north are doing very quantitative work, and the sort of empirically based qualitative work that you do has fallen out of favor a bit. So as a comparative, the SuPWR project really challenges that sort of narrowness and can really bring some empirical cases to a wider audience that doesn't normally get exposed to these cases for sort of South Asia and not just only India, which, as Suhaila said, up till now has really been focused on Latin America and Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, in terms of discussions of backlash. And it kind of raises for me all sorts of questions I'd be interested to hear you talk a bit more about the sort of debates about transferability. And I noticed in one of the synopsis you talked about bringing approaches that are not normally used in the study of South Asia to the study of South Asia, but also thinking about it the other way and how it's possible to sort of ensure that sort of balancing act to make sure that region and contextual specificity doesn't get sacrificed to contributing towards wider debates, but also ensuring that those debates are inclusive. And for me, I suppose, reading the materials and listening today, I mean, there seem to be some very important key elements and themes that you've brought up, particularly around the focus starting from women's movements and women's struggles and women's resistance. A lot of the other research projects around themes of backlash seem to start much more from backlash and anti-gender movements than from the sort of feminist resistance. And also the way that you are addressing these issues in the context of autocratization, de-democratization, autocratic governments, and how they use gender rights. And that is an area that I think we still in general need a lot more work on, and particularly from the South Asian context. And also, I think your focus on strategies, on the generative and productive nature of backlash, even though it is so challenging, but also the internal nature of movements and highlighting the sort of effective elements and the need for caring and intergenerational dynamics. And I think it's led to sort of fantastic insights about coalition building, strategies of sustainability, accomplices, as you talk about them, which I think certainly looking recently at the UK case, we could definitely deal or could have some, given that the divisions, particularly between different feminist groups around gender critical and other feminist groups, have been so divisive, and I think have paralysed UK women's movements in the last couple of years. It would be very helpful for us to reflect on how we might come together around certain issues. I don't know. I had some thoughts. I don't know what my time is like in terms of.
I think if you could continue on for about 2-3 minutes, that would be great.
Okay. Well, I just had a few thoughts. I mean, I'd like to hear your reflections on the methodological and theoretical issues around traveling, conceptual stretching, contextual specificities, and also whether you have any reflections on the term backlash, whether there are any problems with using it or challenges, or thoughts on that. And I had a couple of thoughts, really not very much about building solidarities across regions, mainly from the perspective of being an academic, as I am, and just how important this is, particularly given how a lot of the anti-gender movement are so globalized, and backlash, and how leaders learn from each other, that it is so important that movements resisting backlash also try and do the same kinds of things. But I was sort of thinking about this yesterday, that a lot of research projects seem to be happening quite separately in different parts of the world, and there are lots of connections. So, for example, in Europe, there are a couple of the EU, of course, because of the danger of radical right populism, has funded quite a few projects as part of its Horizon program. And those are both CSINDL and Fierce are looking at kind of some similar issues. But again, much more starting from the perspective of backlash and anti-gender movements rather than from feminist movements. That. So I think there are shared concerns, and it would be great to have more interchange on things like creative and strategic resistance, on sort of internal dynamics of movements. And hopefully, as I say, us in the UK and the US could certainly learn a lot from the insights of SuPWR and around organising and forming alliances. So, yeah.
Thank
Great.
you.
Yeah.
That's really, really great to hear. And, yes, exactly. I mean, I really love how you said about how, we're extending scholarship that has not been applied in South Asia. I think we also need to think about how these insights are informing now literature back beyond South Asia. So thank you very much for that. Naomi.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm so sorry that I'm not there, because every time that I've managed to come to the super meetings, it's been really joyful and, life-affirming experience despite the topics. And I apologize if there's any barking. It's my dog. He likes to bark at the key moments always. And yes, I do remember so well the look on your faces when I gave the feedback to the first version of the proposal. And how well it came out. It really was a tremendous proposal in the end, and that's why it's been a tremendous project. I had a few thoughts. One is on this issue of the word backlash and what it really signals now. When you started this project, I think backlash was something that experts and maybe feminist scholars and progressive activists were noticing much more than others. We were already talking a lot about closing civic space around the world, but backlash, and particularly backlash against the women's rights movement, the global gender equality drive, wasn't quite as, it was in no way as strong as it is today. And in this moment, I think of enormous economic volatility and precarity, going back before the pandemic, but since then, most certainly. And the autocratization that Georgina spoke about, the fact that the Overton window globally has shifted so far to the right, and this whole fear-mongering around birth rates, low birth rates, particularly among white people. I think that this idea of backlash is no longer as fit a term as it once was. It's more of a driving forward thrust of different kinds of masculinity and right-wing politics. So in a way, backlash is almost, it's almost something we remember nostalgically for a time when the world agreed that women should have rights. But I think that this is why I feel that Super you can all collectively speak to the rest of the world with a much louder voice now, because I think Georgina made this point very well, you have already done the work that other countries need to do, other places need to do, about what actually it looks like to organize in this situation. Also on this point, and Maitrayee mentioned this as well, on the generative value of the generative nature of backlash. And, as somebody who studies protests, and I study protests sitting behind my computer with a data set chiefly, I don't often get to speak to people who are doing protests, not as often as I would like anyway. But it's often people like me who sit behind my computer saying, isn't it great? These struggles are amazing. It's so exciting. Oh, look at all of this mobilization. But, when I go down the column and I look at how many people have died and been injured, and the exhaustion, the stress, the time it takes to mobilize, I think we must recognize that mobilizing is always a necessary evil. I know we, as feminists, we will always, it's a forever struggle and all of that, but it's a necessary evil. I remember one of the predecessors to this program, Pathways of Women's Empowerment, and was that Andrea I saw the back of the head of? Yeah. So I remember for Andrea and other colleagues who were part of Pathways back in the day, I did a small piece of work looking at organizing against violence against women. And, my key conclusion from that small piece of work was that it really was a really critical factor in stirring women to mobilize, to organize. It was a founding factor in many women's rights movements that we looked at. But we're not going to welcome violence against women because it mobilizes. Similarly, backlash is evil, and it's intended to be evil. And I think we should be careful with this talk about how generative it is, because, as I say, it's people like me sitting behind desks who appreciate that, and not the people who are on the streets. Lastly, I wanted to say a few words about research. We're getting into the ref cycle now for those of you in the UK university system, and we're being asked to talk a lot about the impact of research. I don't know if you go into the ref with Sussex or anything, not at all. What a shame, because this would be a wonderful impact case study. And I think that we have this tendency to think, oh, well, we have to change the law. And, I know Sohala and others here, Mahinapa, have, of course, a background and have experience of doing those sorts of things with their research and activism. But it's too much in this political moment to be expecting that we would push back against this forward thrust of right-wing politics and masculinity. But the real impact of this research that I can see, that I have seen throughout, is this solidarity, this care, this cross-movement learning. And that's enormous, that's vast. And, you should be looking for more funds, maybe the Horizon funds, although they're not interested in South Asia, but the Horizon grants to do more of this. Because, in these really difficult times, I think this is as much as we can hope for, is this solidarity and cross-movement learning and friendship. And so thank you very much for your work. Appreciate it a really lot.
I mean, that is, yes, and we definitely are very aware. And as you heard, perhaps yesterday, one of our activists, leaders, Bhagwati from Nepal, really shared that pain. That pain of what and the cost at which this mobilization comes, and that cost is borne, as you say, very, very well, unevenly, because it's not people like you, it's not people like us either who bear that cost, right? We go out, we talk with these movements, we've been traveling with these movements for the last 6 years, but ultimately it's them that are the front line, and that is something that we really need to acknowledge very strongly. So thank you for that, and also thank you for the idea of thinking about a Horizon grant for others, because we do need more funds, not only for our research, but mainly for these movements. So, how are they going to continue? And what they are doing, their bid for material gains, etc. It's not easy to be there. So we should keep mobilizing towards directing more funds at these student struggles. So that's great. I'm going to turn over now to Naila.
Yes, thank you very much. My comments are really based on what I've been hearing today. So I've been making notes as I go along, and I'm actually failed. So I hope it all makes sense. I think the terminology or the concepts that came to mind when I was listening today goes back to Gramsci and his ideas about the war of position and the war of maneuver. And I think Bill is right. We're not just in a place of backlash. We're in a place of quite concerted effort for people with very frightening views to come together across the world and wage a war on all the things that we've heard as being progressive. That's the war. But Gramsci talked about the Russian Revolution. We're not in the era of the Russian Revolution, but it's a modern war of maneuver. And the war of position is what we were fighting all this time. Trying to change hearts and minds, trying to win people, trying to create a shift in the way that we think about the world. And in that war of position, we included, obviously, politics of gender, politics of class, race, and so on. But we're now in a different position from that. We're no longer in a war of position because we're under attack. And so what I hear today is, and I quickly looked it up on Google, he also has this idea of war of defense. And I think we are in a defensive phase. Yes, backlash can be generative, but it's not generating enough yet. We're still trying to defend what we've won in the past. So I think one of the lessons that we're hearing today is largely of a defensive nature. Right? It's about deciding, should we be at the table, should we not? Which of the demands we can go ahead with, which is going to lose us votes, lose us support, and we have to think about all this quite carefully. Again, today I heard that the backlash has sustained itself through intersectional solidarity. People like Trump, people like Modi, less clear in Bangladesh, but elite people, powerful people have been able to win support amongst very marginalized people. And what we have tried to do is build an intersectional counter movement. But it's building that intersectional counter movement is where I think we come against. So I think Mona from Nepal talked about the shared experience of pain, of exclusion, building solidarity and lived experiences. That's not enough. If you read this amazing book by Lear, one of the points she makes in the context of where did she come from? Albania, yeah. It was class socialists who gave up their privileges to fight for the working class. So just sharing experiences is not enough. We have to learn how to cross those divides. People in this room are elites. We are all elites. We are not the activists. So the issue is, how does one build solidarity across class divides, across identity divides, without monopolizing or taking over, and yet sharing the lessons that we have learned from our own experiences. So I found that a challenge. I think keeps disappearing. This is okay. Just a few comments here and there. When Chandana talked about the NGOization of the women's movement, I thought, no, it's the projectization of the women's movement. If you look at the NGOs that began in Bangladesh in the 70s, they were getting funding from outside, but they were getting solidarity funding. There was no attempt to influence what they did and what they didn't. It's when that funding becomes projectized and you have to fit in a logical framework and you have to report on results that the NGO starts to lose its radical edge. And so even today, a few radical NGOs remain because they are funded by people who are not asking for that. But it gets more and more difficult as the funding dries up for these people. This is not a good idea. Sohela talked about using evidence in case studies, using stories. And this is when we come against, as academics, the iron cage of ref, the iron cage of disciplinary boundaries, the iron cage of referee judges that don't produce an article till 3 years after the event. Because the stories we need are accessible stories. They should be able to build on people. So I really think, in a way, this research will have its greatest impact. And what I also liked about, again, going back to Mona, she spoke with a passion that comes out of lived experience, but doesn't lend itself to a refereed article, So refereed articles are not going to spread the word. What is going to spread the word is being able to do the animations, being able to tell stories, being able to draw on your own pain, but not to drown others in it, to be able to give some hope at the end of it. Back to this bloody thing. I was listening, so. I think the only other 2 points I have is the other phrase that I heard, diverse but not divided. And I think that's very important, but it's also very, very hard. If we are to build, another phrase I heard, and that was from you, Deepta, tactical and strategic, right? I make a distinction between them, and I think it's about time frames. Tactical is what you put together for that aim to meet. Strategic has a longer term vision. But what about beyond strategic? Are these solidarities only going to last as long as we fight the backlash? Or are we going to construct a different kind of thing where there is diversity acknowledged, lived with, but it does not have to be divisive, does not have to be tactical, does not have to be strategic. It is a vision, it's a way of rethinking the world. Let's talk about academics, right? Especially an academic who is retired and is no longer bound by having to publish in referee journals, just do other things. One of the things that struck me, it has been striking me hugely, is very much how divided the world is, right? And yet those divisions have their roots in the same kind of phenomenon. The phenomenon of unregulated markets, the financialization of everything, the commodification of everything. And I don't blame the white working class in the United States. I once talked as part of John Gaventa's program to someone who came from the Appalachians. And he said something that really moved me. He said, we fought so hard to win the rights of the working class in the Appalachians. And with globalization, we are seeing them evaporating. And that prompted me to put together a proposal, a project for John, where we brought someone who worked with labor unions in the United States called Stephanie Luce. I took her to India and Bangladesh to see why they shouldn't be calling for boycotts of every single job that comes out of globalization. And she talked to trade unions. The Indian trade unions all called her madam, and she got very insulted. But I talked to United States trade unions in the East Coast. I talked to the Garment Workers Union, Unison. And one thing that struck me one day on a Sunday, a union organizer, we were in his house, and they were trying to help a woman in a factory. And he said, we cannot help you unless you set up a branch of your union. And she said, we're too frightened. So I thought to myself, here's this country slamming us for not having trade unions and labor rights, and their own people are frightened of joining unions. So this insecurity comes from the same place. It's a very casual globalization that rode roughshod over local communities and local people's rights. So I have this, in the end, an optimist. I would like our program, which is called Gender, Justice and Well-Being. The well-being economy is about justice and well-being. And I would like us to be able to do surveys around the world, not huge fancy ones, but just enough to ask people what matters to them. What matters to them as instant well-being, in everyday well-being? What matters about their aspirations for tomorrow? And what do they think of justice? You know, for instance, do you think you will get ahead of this country because of your effort or because of your connections, right? So there's a ways of getting at these issues of justice. And I would like those surveys, wherever they are in the world, to show that we have more in common than divides us, and to cost what we have in common, and to show that we don't need endless economic growth for people to be happy. So we need to cost that in some ways, and to be able to say, look, we can live with steady state growth. You know, we can even see the decline in growth in some countries. But at the moment, the way we're growing is destroying the planet and holding us all to hostage. So as an academic, I think it's a project of hope, but who knows what we will find.
Thank you, Naila. And yes, the project of hope is what really does keep us together. Definitely. I just wanted to, before we open the panel, I just wanted to also say a huge thank you to our other IIV members who've not been able to make it because of time difference. Anne-Marie Gertz, who's in New York, it's very, very early for her. And also Nirja, who is unwell. So Nirja is a part of so you were impersonating the right person, Maitrayee, but Nirja Gopal-Jayal, who's really under the weather and has not been able to make it. But also a word of immense gratitude to Mala Tun, who passed away sadly during the time of this project. Yeah. And she was part of our international advisory board, and it was always she was just amazing. Every time we talked to her, and the IIV came together, it was such a pleasure to learn from her perspective. She's such a brilliant scholar. So really, just wanted to remember her in this. So you've heard us. You've heard the activists yesterday. You've heard us. You've us as both country people and IDS people, and you've also heard the perspectives of the some external members, both part of this country reference groups as well as the International Advisory Board, and I just wanted to open up the floor. So the floor is open for comments, questions. We take a bunch of comments and questions. And then throw open the floor for any answers, including our collaborators online, who are there. So you can just raise your hands and speak, but also, so we take a bunch of questions first in the room and then online, and I'll give everybody a chance to speak and respond if you want to. So over to you, Yurga. And if you just briefly just introduce yourselves when you ask the question so people know in the room who you are. Great.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm Jörg Redstrom here at IDS. I convene the sister program to SuPWR, which is Countering Backlash, Reclaiming Gender Justice, and working with Sohela and others here at IDS. So thank you so much. This is an amazing workshop event, closing event. Apologies for arriving late. I had been listening in online this morning and yesterday, in fact, a little bit as well. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things raised by Naomi and Georgina recently, just now, and sort of echoing the importance of discourse and narratives. I love the idea, what you said, Nyla, triggered an idea in my head, that political death by log frame. So we need to find ways of speaking and sharing accessible lessons. So the word backlash raised by Naomi, of course, historically here at IDS, 6-7 years ago when we were working on these projects, putting them together, backlash was not recognized or talked about easily at IDS or elsewhere. I was actually at SuPWR in 2019, and very, very few people would connect with the word backlash. They were trying to drum up some support, which eventually paid off. We spent a couple of years in the beginning of countering backlash, also with cross conversations with SuPWR, of course, around what is backlash? Is this the right term? And that all debate, and that wasted a lot of ink and partake in the early years. But I will defend the term because not only because now, this year in SuPWR, everybody is talking about backlash. There are sessions on backlash and countering backlash and so on, all across the board. So it's really traveled, and it's got people to focus. It's not only the term, of course, but it has become more current. So we picked up the term because Susan Faludi used it to focus our minds on patriarchal backlash, and that was particularly important for me because it pointed to the problem, not just this kind of individualistic notion that people lash back. And that's really useful because actually, sort of experientially and, backlash is a pushback for feminist movements and gender justice, anybody concerned with gender justice. So at that kind of level, it is collectively a backlash, but it's about a lot much more, which we learned very early on, of course. And the enemies, the forces that was alluded to earlier, sort of the roots, the common roots of this problem, and the enemies don't only affect gender movements and feminists, in fact, which is, yeah. So just a quick reflection then on Georgina Waylen's call for a kind of reflection on the transferability of lessons across regions without losing context and so on. Of course, countering backlash is a cross-regional project, and these conversations are being had in different regions. And what we need is much more of those conversations, because the more we share, the more we realize what we have in common. And of course, yes, there are there are contextual specificities in all regions. And there's still regions who are left out of this conversation, I feel, particularly in East Asia. We need to really engage with East Asia, West Africa to some extent, and there'll be other regions. But there is a body of research happening all over that needs to be connected. But it's not only cross-regional, it's also cross levels, from community action and civil or justice movements to politicians and global actors at the CSW, at the intergovernmental meetings in Geneva and elsewhere. Those really matter, and people are paying attention. I just got emails from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something a couple of weeks ago, and again yesterday, because they are already looking at this and wanting to engage. And so I'll stop there, just reflecting on the word backlash. Yes, okay, it's a word, it's limited, but it's helped us focus minds. Then cross-regional conversations, we also need to think about local to global conversations. much more to be said, of course.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great. So let's open up the floor. You know, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shivangi, and I study at IDS, Gender and Development. Back at home, I'm from India, and I was a computer science engineer who wanted to intersect gender and technology. And I also run my nonprofit back in India. So my question is also related to my dissertation because we are preparing for it. So, is gender backlash also kind of like your research? Is it related to rise in misogynistic cultures on tech platforms? Is there a correlation? Is there a research where I can read it? I know Becky mentioned something that she's about to, like her paper will be published in something, but do we have anything around it that would make me understand more on it?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take a few more. There's one online. Yeah, let's take that one.
Thank you. So the question is, how do you tackle fascism and neoliberalism in your research at the grassroots, as these are externalities of a common hegemon? The transnational colonial patriarchy, currently on full display as petromasculinity and warlording. And have certain fractions of South Asian feminist ontologies been kind to capitalism, risking the movement's ultimate objective of restructuring power?
Well, okay, it's a really good question, but okay, let's go to Harvey.
So there was so much talk about. Yeah, I will. There was so much talk about commonality that I thought I would also reflect on about like the connections that have been built and what it means for knowledge production, especially Southern knowledge production that's being done at IDS. So I'm Noveli. I am from Bangladesh as well. I've been working in the SuPWR project and the Countering Backlash project. And before that, I used to be in the Dhaka University in Bangladesh, the Women and Gender Studies department, which is very underfunded, a very worn down department. And I was 20 something years old when I was reading one of the papers of the Pathways project. And I was seeing that new contemporary topics like, okay, the generational gap, how does it help to mobilize? And even that work was done, 5-6 years ago. And from there, learning about those things, and just a student at the Women and Gender Studies department in Bangladesh, she learned so much about it, and she learned so much about it that she got interested in it and started working for BIGD with Mahin Appa and Sohela Appa in the SuPWR project for 2 years and in the Countering Backlash project, where I was a respondent because I was also engaged in feminist activism in Bangladesh at the time. And the thing is, there is so much commonality and also so much connections in it. See, Mahin Appa, who was our researchers, was also a member of the Women's Affairs Women's Reform Commission. And the people who were working with them, who are sitting right here, they have interacted with so many activists, intergenerational connections that have built movements that went out like Rage Against Rape that happened because these conversations, these connections were built. They were able to mobilize because of this. So knowledge production has like a vice versa effect on activism as well. And that is the most reflected in the South Asian context, I think. A lot of the findings of Pathways project said how because of, let's say, projectization, since Nailapa has said it's not necessarily individualization, it's projectization. So how, yeah. So projectization was making a divide, let's say, between elite feminists and the ones who are working in the grassroots are not able to access these funds. But there's so much connection there. There's so many stories and there's so much mutual care there that needs to be translated into research and into activism. And it has so much potential to go forward. So my question would be, how are you translating all these findings that you have come up with, and this was a 6-year longitudinal project. This has so much potential to go forward as well. So my question, which I think you're going to hate a bit, is that what's coming after countering backlash and super? Because there's so much evidence and so much data there. So yeah.
Okay, great. Really important and good question, but yeah, let's move on to, yeah.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm also from the MA Gender Development. I'm here on a double degree, so I started a research in Brazil. And I did some interviews with teachers about sex education in public schools in São Paulo, about the impact of political polarization about gender and sexuality in their work. And they told me that they kept doing the same things that they did before Bolsonaro. For anyone who, I think everyone knows who Bolsonaro was and is. But they kept doing the same work because the curriculum was the same. So the institution kind of protected them, but they were afraid of saying certain things because of the families, because of certain things. Even after Bolsonaro's era in Brazil. So I wanted to understand, how can we understand backlash as something that is countercultural in a more subtle ways? It's not only part of the institutions, but something that stayed, especially in Brazil, and now it is allowing for Bolsonaro's son to get elected, because we got now Lula, and now it's again Bolsonaro's son who is running for the election. So I wanted to understand how to think about that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Any more thoughts, questions? Mona's got her hand up, but there's also
Yes.
Pass it on to Nikhil and then come back to you, Mona. Is that okay? And then we'll, yeah.
Hi, I'm Nikhil. I was a student here, I think 13 years ago, with Shandana. And I now work for the Open Society Foundations. So my team is called Network Grants. We fund movements, collectives, and networks globally. And it sounds great, but it's hard in practice with the unraveling we have currently. So I have two reflections and a question. I just got back from South Africa, where the political trajectories about building power are strong with apartheid. And the call there was clear. It is a moment not of contestation. It is a moment to build power. It is a moment to organize. And we have history around doing this. We also fund organizations who do not recognize the moment as one of building power. And because it is also a moment of anxiety. And so in moments of anxiety, you do the things that you've been doing for a long time. I think Nyla's word was, I think it was the Gramsci quote of maneuvering, right? We're still doing things that no longer serve us, right? The translating of grounded struggles into advocacy spaces which hold no worth anymore. So in this time of where we need to build power, second thing on South Africa, the need for joy to sustain us, right? It was super clear from South Africa, and it was super clear from young activists. I wanted to hear if that came out in South Asia. It's hard, right? But so my question now, to build and to make this generative, we need to recognize the moment. And people on the margins recognize the moment really clear, but others don't. So how do we tell the stories that allow us to build the unlikely alliances so that we could start recognizing this moment?
Thank you. That's again another really good question, and we will definitely, the joy that did come out was quite incredible. And I'll respond to that, but I wanted to give Mona the floor first, and then we carry on. Yeah, Mona, close yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepta. My question is to Nella. Thank you, Nella. I loved listening to you. Of course, like sharing pain is not I understand that sharing pain is not the end point. But then it is the entry point, and the research also showed the same. At least, like, it's the entry point that makes deeper political work possible. That's how we saw that. And you are absolutely right that sharing pain alone is not enough to sustain solidarity, and to build the structural, change that we are looking for. Then my question is, as you said, like, it's not enough, which I agree. My question is, like, how do we build political solidarity without first building that emotional, relational, or, like, that embodied trust that allows movement to work through their differences? If not that, from where to begin? What's your suggestion?
Great, thank you, Mona. Are there any more questions online? Okay, in no particular order, anybody who wants to go first? It could be the people who've spoken in this session, but I also invite my team members, both in person and online. We have Mohammed also, who came into the Super Project from Bangladesh. We have Georgina, who's here from Nepal, and she was part of the Nepal team. So we're very, very pleased and honored to have you all amongst us, and so like, if the floor is open to both the panelists of this panel, but also to wider. So who would like to start? Do you want to, Nyla?
I'll just pick up on 2 points. One is what Mona said. Absolutely, it's an entry point. And through the ages, and whether we look at women's movements or self-help groups, etc., that thing of narrating your biography and finding out what you share in common and finding out that pain, that is hugely important. And it builds a connection that can be the platform or the foundation for the future. But also, as you said, it's not enough. And what we have to also learn is what motivates people, not from your background, perhaps from an elite background, what motivates them to cross over and want to be a part of a movement that builds justice. So that, I didn't mean to sort of devalue the importance of that. I think the other thing is what Andrea said. And to me, that ability of the right to unify around something, I don't see it amongst progressives. And I have now started to quote, and I'm sorry if you all have heard this before, I start to quote this saying that I read, and it just struck me, and it said, the right looks for converts, the left looks for traitors. If you don't share every single thing that I believe, I want nothing more to do with you, right? I remember as a student in the old days, as they say, what is it? Back in the day, a white South African woman got up and said, if you're not for us, you're against us. At that time, it felt fine. It was about apartheid. And if you're not for apartheid, But now, politics is so complex, and identity politics has made it even more complex. Is it not possible to form alliances with people who believe fundamentally in the core things that we believe in, but have doubts about other things, right? Is that not possible? I don't know. And so Andrea's giving an example. That's what held them together, but that is anti other people. It's an anti. Is there something, and that's why this business of well-being, to me, could be something that if we could demonstrate that what really gives us joy and happiness and what really doesn't cost a lot, and it's what we share. That's going a bit far from the discussion. But if we look at some of the literature on feminism, and, Dawn asked in 1985, we might have a vision, but how do we get from here to there, right? Nancy Fraser talks about, radical options and then reformist options with radical potential. So can we not aim for the stars, but just something in between, And I remember a long time ago thinking about these things. I made a distinction between strategic idealism, which is the vision, and strategic pragmatism, which is how you get there. And Amitav Ghosh, I've been thinking about this. So Amitav Ghosh says, to dream something is not the same as building it. When you come to building it, you have to make compromises. You have to put aside your own etc. So it's a much
well-chosen compromises.
Well-chosen compromises, So I think, to me, it's those things that we have to think about rather than insisting on a very purist politics.
Thank you. Okay, I would like to ask if Maitrayee, Naomi, Georgina, you've got any responses to any of these comments, thoughts, questions? Naomi.
I think Georgina got there first. It's Georgina.
I don't have much to say apart from I was very taken by Andrea's example from CSW about the capacity of the right to unify and make alliances and find common concerns. But there's also, I think, another element to this as well, which is resources. I mean, the right is so well funded, whether it's from, evangelical Christian millionaires putting money in, and that, I think, is something that needs to be taken into account. How do we counter just that inequality of resources? But in all sorts of ways, not just money, but access to media, all kinds of things, ownership of media.
Yes, echoed by a lot of us, especially like the access to spaces, of discourse and practice. Naomi.
Yeah, I was struck by what Julia was saying about her experiences in Brazil. Did I understand that rightly? It was in Brazil, and I was remembering the kind of the rage, the white heat of rage I was feeling in Bangladesh in January, where we were having an election after, whatever Sahela was saying about how it always appeared that Bangladesh welcomed, efforts to empower women and give them rights and so on. And this is the absolute opposite. And I was raging in all my encounters with the senior academic men and policy men that I was meeting, one of whom, when I said to him that it was shocking that they had a consensus commission, which was all male, all Muslim, all upper class. He said, well, we've had, he said it only partly jokingly, we had a woman in charge for the last 15 years. And I can't tell you, the rage was so cleansing. But there is that cultural dimension. You feel almost ashamed of pushing an agenda that is so out of kilter with what the rest of the world, where the rest of the world is going and thinking. And that's why, coming together, meeting other feminists, which I did a lot of in Bangladesh, was the only thing that really saved me from having a stroke, I think. I was so angry all the time. Anyway, we have to come together more, but we have to recognize also that the backlash, I don't agree with Yerka that it's still a backlash. It's now the culture has really shifted in such a way that it's almost, you almost have to feel shame to be a feminist these days, or a progressive in any way. And that thing is quite hard to fight against. Anyway, thank you, Julia, for your thoughts on that, because I thought that was very interesting.
Thanks, Naomi. And yes, I mean, the rage. So I think we also do have a paper, one of our papers is on affect, and Priya might tell you a little bit more about that, but like it's about these emotions that these activists feel, the rage, the anger, the joy, but also, some of these, emotions that, you're not supposed to feel as an activist, exhaustion. You're supposed to have endless amount of energy. But I'm going to give Priya the floor, and then Sahela, and then Chandana, and then we'll see if there's anybody else who wants to add anything.
Yes. Thanks. So three sort of responses on the things of backlash, the term, whether it's appropriate. The second on solidarity in various cases for it, and what works with us and what we see in the project. And then finally on affect in the end. So on backlash, we also similarly spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I think it felt particularly ironic because it's a term that does not translate at all as such.
Yeah.
It does not directly translate into any of the languages that we were working or thinking in. But then we did recognize that there is a need for a term or frame that captures this sort of shared group subset of experiences and effects that people were relating. And at some level, I think, at least I personally don't feel really precious about or attached to the term or frame, but feel very attached to the idea that we need a way to index this phenomenon transnationally in a way that captures what is common and what is shared, and to be able to strategize against that collectively. And thinking of backlash structure and event is part of what we're trying to do, that to try and bring together as much as we can without losing contextual specificity. On the question of solidarity, again, something that so much of this project has been engaged in really unpicking. Something, I think for me, one of the most striking movements or collectives in this regard was the Nepal Mahila Ekta Samaj, which is a squatter or landless women's group throughout Nepal, but we specifically work with a lot of the squatter women in Kathmandu, and Georgina will have a lot to say about this. And what was really striking was how very cohesive they were as a movement. There was this real sense of my destiny is fundamentally tied up with yours. And part of how that was demonstrated is that a lot of women from this movement, as Mona mentioned earlier, secured land ownership certificates, moved out of these communities, had no reason to be actively involved in organizing, but absolutely remained as, if not more, invested in the movement and its everyday functioning. And what was striking about the movement is that they did not share the attributes that usually bring movements together. So neither were there shared inherited identities. They were all from different ethnicities, regions. A lot of them were displaced during the Mao struggle from different parts of Nepal, not even similar caste. Also not shared ideologies. Quite often, different members of NMES would contest elections with different parties, right? So neither the identities or ideologies that usually bind groups were true in this case. But what they did so powerfully and frequently narrate that it was that shared experience of some sort of dispossession, pain, discrimination, but also hugely a shared experience of resistance. So a lot of what they would say when you ask them their origin story as a movement, they would go back to this one slum demolition that they stood in front of, and they would, each time they recounted it, would cry about, when the tractors came and the police came and the sort of the lathi charges that they had to face. And it was only a little while later that we discovered actually none of these women were from that settlement. Right? None of them were actually directly affected by it. But we had always thought it was their collective story, that this is something that, was actually something they had experienced. But it was the fact that all of them had been at Thapatali or had heard from someone at Thapatali and really felt it as their own experience. And I guess that then brings me to this idea of affect and this shared affective horizon. And it's something Claire Hemmings has written about in terms of affective solidarity, of affect as that substrate rather than shared identity or ideology or any of that. And it is, again, something that we're trying to make sense of, because people have written about the sort of affects that are mobilized by the right wing or by backlash actors, right? The forms of ontological insecurity, the forms of hatred, of anxiety, anger, and how those are mobilized. But we know a little less about how affects circulate within women's movements, but also how they are strategically mobilized, because movements want to move people. And so that's why we're also thinking and writing about these sort of affective opportunity structures that we saw them use really powerfully. And Naila, when you're asking how do we move people who have nothing to lose or nothing to gain by their involvement, there is perhaps something about more thoughtfully and strategically tapping into the affective register to understand how to bring people along.
This is just quickly responding to some of the points that were raised in terms of what do we add or lessons from South Asia. So when we started the project, we knew that we were bringing different bodies of literature, or at least trying to make them speak to each other. So there's the South Asian feminist literature and the narrative that relies on post-colonial analysis and what the state is like and all of that. There's the gender and politics literature that looks at, okay, policy processes and what do you do? How do you form coalition? And then there's the backlash literature at the time when we started, which was overwhelmingly focused on global north. So trying to make them speak has been a challenge, but I think we have made some connections, and our own analysis has been it's quite interesting to see what elements it has picked up and brought together. And we are not at the end of the story yet. But methodologically, and this is responding to Georgina's question in terms of what are the challenges, and Chandana probably will elaborate more on that, is trying to focus on or starting with the movements themselves and trying to have a bottom-up perspective. So capturing those stories, the workshops, the theater-based methods, along with, we had a comparative design. So then we had to think about what are the contextual elements like? And we had a political economy lens for that, but also to think through then how do you compare the case studies with the rigor? Because while refereed articles don't necessarily travel in particular ways, but this is an academic grant. And there was a point raised in terms of what's next and funding and all of that. We will also have to perform, and we will be measured by that performance, right? And impact is measured in different ways by different people, right? So we have to think about our constituencies. So there was a tension, and then unpicking that, and I think we are still struggling with that. I don't say we have solved everything yet, but the fact that each of us are from different disciplinary backgrounds and the papers have different thirsts, and who we are speaking to then shapes what is it that we are picking and what are we struggling with. Having said that, this is more about the empirical lessons that South Asia can offer. One thing is when we started looking at the backlash literature and the way it's framed, that how religious right is forming with the populist groups, we thought, okay, but religion always existed in South Asian politics. It never took a backseat. Right? So we always contended with that. So for us, that was a surprising element. And I think we have lessons to offer in terms of how do you counter that? What do you do? In Bangladesh, we had to take them into account as veto players. In Pakistan, they were already in formal powerful positions, institutionalized position. You heard about the Islamic Council, right? So contending what you do, not just in terms of family law, it seeps into other areas and other forms of rights that you normally think, well, what would religious groups have to do with this? But they do, because social norms matter, right? History matters in terms of how women's public presence have been shaped. The other bit is autocratization and the spaces that you exist. So you heard about, do we stay at the table? What do we do? What we found, and it is being held in other countries also, is that if institutional spaces exist, so for example, if your higher judiciary has independence still, your recourse would be very different than if that space is gone. Similarly with bureaucracies, like in Bangladesh, you heard the transition story. Now, if the bureaucracy is so politicized, and our bureaucracies look different in of the 4 different South Asian countries, but if bureaucracy is so politicized that they belong to one party or the other, where is your space? Is that a neutral actor in a sense that public administration is supposed to act and be accountable for? So the strategies that we use would be important for countries where you are seeing erosion now, both in terms of act now and stop erosion, because the bigger story, I mean, there was a question about how do we appeal about backlash and what stories do we tell? So it's important to say this is not just about gender equality. Gender equality is connected very clearly to the de-democratization process, and that is what you're defending, or whatever that is big in your country that you are defending with gender, right?
I've just been reminded that it's 1:30 and we need to stop, so this is going to be really quick. But in my non-super life, I studied democracy and polarization, and I was really struck by the extent to which we have come back to that context repeatedly in today's discussion. So I think these next steps, Novelli, part of this is our ability across various networks is to be able to bring these two things together, these big forces that we're now dealing with, observing. We don't have the ability yet to be able to say how they come together. And I say that to some extent from the point of view of from inside Pakistan as well. To your point, Andrea, is for the longest time we have understood that the left in Pakistan is completely fragmented when the right is so unified. It's an old story for us. It's just watching how they can differ in so many things, but come together on just knowing what that ideology is that they want to impose. We've said that about the left. We have said that repeatedly through this project as well about women's movements and the extent to which they fragment as well on sort of fairly small issues, as you said sometimes, and are not connected. So we can keep talking about the need for solidarity, but why it doesn't happen is a question that we need to connect to these larger forces and start naming those forces. Is it fascism? Is it a new form of racism? Is it just authoritarianism of some other variety? But the entire issue is actually complicated by gender, because in South Asia already we've said, if you go back to Fraser, if you go back to any using the lens of democratization, I'm going to say the issue is inequality. We have never seriously dealt with that. Democracy has no ability to automatically deal with inequality. This has to be a process of intent. But in South Asia, the left-right division around inequality doesn't work the way it does in Western Europe or in the global North, because in those levels of poverty, everybody has to speak that language of wanting to do something about poverty. But on gender, it's even more complicated, because the movements we're talking about may exist across the spectrum as well. The women's issue is everywhere. And the extent to which we are able to then unify across the things that are now polarizing us, the ways in which we want to see ourselves as polarized, because it really is a choice to some extent as well, is to say, I'm with this side. The extent to which we are now doing that consciously across social media, across everything, I think gender is a really good way to get beyond a lot of that, to say, actually, these groups, those asking for rights, gender rights, women's rights, are across all sides of this. And so that solidarity is even more complicated by those divisions. We don't have that answer. And I think that's the direction that we really should be moving in now.
Great, thank you very much. I am not going to summarize this very, very rich discussion, but just to say thanks very much to our panelists, Naila, Maitrayee, Naomi, Georgina, Sohala, thank you so much. I would be remiss if I didn't thank our funders, ESRC, who have been so generous with and so flexible with our demands, with our changing, goalposts about oh, let's try this method, or it's been a real pleasure to work with such a flexible donor. So thank you very much to ESRC, and I'm hoping that our coordinator Marzena is listening in, and she couldn't be here today either because of a clash. But then also thanks to some of the people who have been really behind the scenes. Leah, you've been incredible, and before Leah there was Emily, and so all of the social media stuff, the animations, the films, the direction of saying, okay, what is the story? Who's the audience? So thank you so much for pushing us to do that for both. So Emily Wilson started in this position and then had to move, and then Leah took on, and we've been very lucky to have both of them here. So thank you so much for that. Debbie West, who you have not seen in person, but she is the magician who holds all solutions to all project problems, and we would not have been able to do that without her. Again, changing budget lines, saying, oh, but we really want to do this workshop, but where's the money going to come from? So the amazing project manager, keeping us to deadlines, to schedule, but also being incredible in all the support that you have given us, Debbie. So thank you so much for that. Chung, you've been very quiet, but you have done a lot of our coding. You came in late into the project, but you've really helped with the NVivo coding, and so thank you so much for that. And above all, I think that beyond the project findings, what we have done is we've established these relationships between researchers, between activists, across borders, with movements. We've built, like in Mona's words, strong and safe spaces so that we could also express our pain, our joy, our frustration at things like ref and publications and journal articles to people who are facing the backlash, but they've been so open and so welcoming to us. So thank you so much. And I really hope this is not the end. This is not the end. I refuse to accept it, because otherwise it'll be like, okay, well, like what? But we will very much try to go in some research directions, but also maintaining these relationships with these movements is incredibly important to us. So watch the space. We will hopefully come up with a book on solidarity. We were thinking about that. We are thinking about journal articles. And if you want to talk to us, please do reach us. We're very open to suggestions. So thank you very much to everybody who's been patiently listening online. And thank you very much for everybody who's been here. So a big round of applause to all of you and to the movement.
It's actually